the United States, it's true, if you look at the US government, wages war in predominantly Muslim countries. The victims of drone attacks, etc., are predominantly Muslim. However, we have to point out the United States makes a distinction between what it considers good Muslims and bad Muslims. And sometimes it is not obvious who the good Muslims and who the bad Muslims are. So for instance, the Saudis are good Muslims. Does that have anything to do with their interpretation of Islam? Of course not. You know, because if we said, well, the United States is only opposed to like the most prehistoric versions of Islam, the Salafist, well, the Saudis have the strictest, most misogynistic versions of Islam. But the United States is perfectly okay with that because Saudi Arabia has traditionally been a US ally in the region for obvious geopolitical and geoenergy reasons. Excellent. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to speak louder than I usually speak. Usually I talk quietly and people complain about that, but I hear the music, so I'm going to talk loudly. First question, how long should I talk loudly?
No more than 30 minutes.
Okay, no more than 30 minutes. I'll be able to answer one of your questions in that time. First, Michael neglected to say that he gave me my first job. I wouldn't be here today without Michael. Now, after he hired me, he said to me confidentially, I have no idea why I hired you. You were terrible in your interview, but he hired me, and for that, I am grateful.
And so am I.
And we have worked together really ever since, whether formally or informally. And I've heard about these salons. They are legendary. And I'm just delighted to be here and be part of it, even if it's mini-me participating in a mini salon. So first, just a little explanation. Right now I'm doing a fellowship in which I am revisiting the people that I talked to 23 years ago, because 23 years ago, Michael and the American Friends Service Committee hired me to do the groundwork for a program here in this region. And they just sent me here with no guidance at all and very little money. But it was a great experience. I had complete freedom because there was no internet and phones were expensive, and so they could not control me. And I could go anywhere I wanted and talk to anybody I wanted. And I sent them reports every week that I printed out on a portable printer that I carried with me. And now 23 years later, I am contacting the same people and re-interviewing them. And when I meet them again, they don't remember me. But they remember my printer. They say, yeah, you're the guy with the little printer. This guy in Germany said, yeah, we had this whole room that was a printer. And then you came and you had a printer that was this big. I couldn't believe it. You, I don't remember. Your printer, I remember. But it's fascinating to talk to people again, to re-interview them, and to give them a copy of the interview from 23 years ago so they can see what they said and compare. I usually give them the interview after I interview them the second time. And they say, oh, some people have very good memories. Other people are a little surprised by what they said. I'm going eventually to write a book about this, in which I look at some of the things that went right, some of the positive stories, and the things that went wrong. Most of the stories, unfortunately. And I'll also do a theater performance. I do one-man shows, and I take the most interesting story and I dramatize them in the words of the people themselves. I really don't add anything. I maybe subtract something, make it a little shorter, and then show what has happened in the region over this period of time. I'll come back to this after I talk about Islamophobia. just to give you a little taste of some of the stories and some of the positive things, maybe some of the positive trajectories, and some of the experiences that I've been hearing. But last year, I published a book on Islamophobia. And most people, their first question is, why did I publish a book on Islamophobia? Because I am not an expert on Islam. I don't speak Arabic. I'm not a Middle East expert. And I didn't write a book about Islam. I wrote a book about perceptions of Islam, generally negative perceptions of Islam. I'm not Muslim. I'm not even religious. But I decided to write this book when I got an email from my father-in-law. Now, my father-in-law sends a lot of emails. He's kind of like Vox Populi. He sends just all the kind of emails you get all the time that have been forwarded by people. And most of the time, these emails are offensive, you know? And you're like, ooh, I really wish that person did not forward me that email. And you delete it. And he forwards those kinds of things. This was an email that was supposedly an article from a newspaper in Spain. And it was entitled "The Wrong People." And the article was about how the wrong people were killed in Auschwitz. Now, of course, who was killed in Auschwitz? Jews were killed in Auschwitz. The article begins by talking about how great Jews are. Jews are smart. Jews have won a lot of Nobel Prizes. Jews have contributed a great deal to world culture. But in Europe, there aren't that many Jews, especially in Spain, after many Jews got kicked out in 1492. Not many Jews in other parts of Europe because of the Holocaust. The wrong people were killed, this article said. Well, who then were the right people? Who were the people that should have been killed? Well, that's when it gets even uglier. And as a Jew myself, I found this very, very disturbing. Because the article went on to talk about Muslims in Europe with all of the stereotypes once used to describe Jews in Europe. The exact same negative stereotypes. That Jews were foreign. That Jews were dirty. That Jews were like insects. That Jews did not contribute to society. And that Jews should be kicked out of society. Every single one of those stereotypes was then applied to Muslims. I found this extremely disturbing, and I also found the fact that this email was then sent to thousands and thousands of people around the United States and around the world. Because I didn't just get it once. I got it more than once. And then, when I actually did a little research and discovered that the original article didn't appear in a Spanish newspaper, it appeared in a Spanish internet site, and didn't have that title, it was an offensive article, yes, but it wasn't as offensive as this kind of interpretation with this additional title added to it of the wrong people. Then I thought, this is really becoming very, very disturbing. This was the summer of 2010. And I don't know if you remember what was happening in the United States in the summer of 2010. I don't know, does anybody remember off the top of your head what was happening? Occupy. Well, it was a little before Occupy. In the summer of 2010. There were protests outside of something called the Ground Zero Mosque in New York City. This was, in fact, the summer of Islamophobia. Before the summer of 2010, actually the word Islamophobia wasn't very popular or very well known in the United States. It was only really around these protests and then other protests that took place outside other mosques in the United States, and culminating, if you might remember, with the threat by a very obscure preacher in Florida to burn the Quran. These events led up to a Time magazine cover story on Islamophobia. And this was kind of the, shall we say, the debut of this issue in American society. And it was also very important because it was right before the midterm elections in the United States. And Islamophobia became a very important topic for the elections. It was around this time that I said to myself, the only people who are really talking about Islamophobia, who are criticizing Islamophobia, are, well, Muslims. And I think it's really important for other people to stand up and say, yes, we too, we who are not Muslims, also think this is a horrible, terrible set of stereotypes. In the same way that after 9/11, virtually the entire Muslim community around the world, from Iran to all small mosques throughout the United States, throughout Europe, stood up and said what happened in New York on 9/11 was wrong. It was not in keeping with Muslim tradition. If Muslims were going to stand up en masse, huge numbers all around the world, every major Muslim organization, the least that non-Muslims can do is to stand up when Muslims are being attacked physically and verbally in the United States, in Europe, and around the world. So this is the reason that I decided to write this book, even though I am not an expert on Islam. I want to answer your question first, because I have 2 chapters in the book about Islamophobia in the United States and Islamophobia in Europe. And they are very, very different phenomena, even though they might sound the same, because many of the stereotypes are the same. And in my book, I talk about the 3 major stereotypes about Islam. That Islam is inherently violent, that Muslims are inherently deceptive, and that Islam is out to take over the world. These are the 3 major stereotypes that you find as part of Islamophobia, and I should just step back and say Islamophobia is an unfounded fear of Islam and Muslims. That's basically the definition of Islamophobia. But these are the 3 kind of fears, ungrounded, stereotypical fears that are part of Islamophobia today and have been part of Islamophobia going all the way back, more than 1,000 years of Islamophobia in the Western tradition, and not just the Western tradition, but primarily the Western tradition. But Islamophobia is, as I said, very different in the United States and Europe because Muslim populations in the United States and Europe are very different. In the United States, demographically speaking, Muslims have one of the highest standards of living of a community in the United States. Middle class, upper middle class. Now, of course there are exceptions. There are plenty of immigrant communities that are Muslim in the United States that do not enjoy high socioeconomic status. But I'm talking generally. Muslims have a very high economic status. In Europe, that's not the case. In Europe, largely immigrant population, and the same kind of stereotypes that in the United States you find that are put against Latinos and immigrants in the United States, primarily Latino immigrants, are applied to mostly Muslim immigrants in Europe. So it's a very different kind of picture. So let me give you an example of that different kind of picture. An example of Islamophobia in the United States. Has anybody heard or seen the TV show All American Muslim? Well, I'm not surprised because it didn't last very long. All American Muslim was a show about ordinary Muslims living in Michigan, outside of Detroit. Detroit is one of the largest communities of Muslims living in the United States. It was a reality TV show, and I'm sure you've all seen some kind of reality TV show. And this was pretty typical. It just followed the lives of these folks, and one was a policeman, and then someone was a coach in the football team, and one of the women was a social worker. I mean, they just lived very ordinary lives. There was an article published in the newspaper very prominently that said the thing that's wrong with this TV show is that it doesn't have any terrorists on it. Because, well, if you want to be representative of Muslims, you have to have a terrorist. Now, did anybody say anything like that about, I don't know, a show that purported to be a reality TV show about Christians living in the United States? Or young men living in the United States? Why didn't they have someone on a reality TV show on the Jersey Shore? Jersey Shore on the shore, reality show on the shore, reality show on the shore, reality show on the Jersey Shore, Jersey Shore, reality show on the shore, reality show on the Jersey, reality show on the shore, reality show on the Jersey Shore, on the Jersey Shore, on the Jersey Shore, reality reality on the shore, reality on the shore, reality on the Jersey Shore, reality on the shore, reality on the Jersey Shore, And the Basques were angry, so the Basques attacked back. But the poem that we read today has substituted Muslims for Basques. Moreover, the very qualities which we in the poem say are part and parcel of Muslims, that they're violent, deceptive, and want to take over the world, actually really apply to Charlemagne, who was inherently violent, who broke his word, and wanted to take over Spain and plenty of other places as well. I bring up this poem because, as I said, it's the same myths that we apply to Muslims today, but it's the same process as well. In other words, we are in US foreign policy and often in European foreign policy saying that Muslims are this way when in fact we are this way in our foreign policy, attacking other countries, deceiving other countries. Edward Snowden perhaps could give us a lecture about that. And through various methods trying to control the world. So in my book, I talk about differences in Islamophobia in the United States and in Europe. And I talk about the mechanisms by which we apply these myths to Muslims when in fact, basically they reflect anxieties we have about ourselves and our role in the world. Okay, I'm going to say a couple of positive things and then circle around back to Eastern Europe and close there. I'm going to start with Katie Couric. I'm going to start with Katie Couric. Oh, thank you. Because Katie Couric said an interesting thing. Katie Couric,
Say who she is.
yeah, I barely know who she is myself because I never watch television. But she's on the Today Show, and she's a very popular TV personality in the United States. And at the end of 2010, she was doing a year in review. And she was asked, well, what do you think about the most important things that happened here in the United States in 2010? And she said, and I was quite surprised, and everybody was surprised, because Katie Couric, she usually does kind of puff pieces, fluffy pieces, nice pieces, news pieces. She said, I really was disturbed about Islamophobia this year. Really. I mean, this Ground Zero mosque controversy, and I can talk about that if you like, but I want to keep this to 30 minutes. I was really disturbed about this guy who wants to burn a Quran. And she said, what I really think should happen is, I think there should be a Cosby show for Muslims. She said, the Cosby show, Bill Cosby, great African-American comedian, was a star of a TV show about the Huxtables, an upper middle class family. She said, I really think that changed people's attitudes towards African Americans in the United States. And what we need is a Cosby show for Muslims to change people's attitudes towards Muslims. Now, I'm going to say positive thing, I'm going to say negative thing. Positive thing is the fact that she talked about Islamophobia. That's great. Negative thing is her understanding of how people's attitudes change in the United States. That somehow Bill Cosby and his TV show transformed American attitudes towards black people. Well, I'm not sure where she was during the civil rights movement, but the important thing here, though, is if you take the civil rights movement and the importance of popular culture, and you add the two of them together, then you start addressing, in an important way, Islamophobia in the United States. And I would say here in Europe too. How many people know about, I forget his first name at the moment, Saif Ramadan is one of the kind of prominent Muslim theologians here in Europe. Saif Ramadan has come out and said repeatedly that the most important thing that Muslims can do here in Europe is assert their rights as citizens and assert their rights as new immigrants or in immigrant communities, immigrant rights. That is part of building a new kind of Europe that is more multicultural and that takes immigrant rights seriously. In other words, an understanding of an assertion of political rights. That's happening here with Muslim communities in Europe. We could talk about various examples. And it's also happening in the United States, and we can talk about some examples of that too. And it's even penetrating the popular culture. Okay, it's true, American Muslim went off the air, but we're seeing other TV shows being developed alongside the civil rights campaigns of Muslim Americans. So that's a positive thing. Let me circle around now to Eastern Europe and close there just to, you can have conversation. I didn't 23 years ago have a chance really to talk to people about Islam or Islamophobia because it really wasn't on the radar 23 years ago. I talked about anti-Roma sentiment. We talked a little bit in those days about anti-immigrant sentiment. In 1990, there were the beginnings of attacks against immigrants in this part of the world, many of them students at the university, many of them running small businesses, had been invited by the communist countries to open up Vietnamese restaurants, for instance, in this part of the world. And there were racist attacks against immigrants. Many immigrants left. That kind of cohort of immigrants went back to their countries because they didn't feel welcome in any way in the new democracies. But some stayed. But most of the kind of racism, it seemed in 1990, and what we built our program around at AFSC was anti-Roma sentiment. That seemed to be the focus of racism at that time. Coming back 23 years later, I am, of course, shocked by the persistence of racism in this part of the world. Racism against, it seems, a greater variety of people, and of course continued racism against Roma. But if you want me to be a little positive, I can be a little positive, because coming back 23 years later, I am also shocked in a good way by some of the positive stories that I've heard. Violeta Draganova from Bulgaria. Violeta Draganova is the first Roma who was a TV newscaster. Visibly Roma, not someone who could pass as just ethnic Bulgarian, but visibly Roma. And not only was she on TV, but she was on the cover of women's magazines as not just a newscaster, but as an example of female beauty. Now, you could say what you will about the negatives associated with that, but from my point of view, it's extremely important for this to happen in Bulgarian society. Now, there are some negatives, of course, associated with that. She appeared on that cover. It was widely sold. She was proud of it. Her brother saw the magazine in the store, and he had to make a decision. He was very proud of his sister, and he wanted to tell his friends about his sister and how she was on the cover of this magazine. But his friends didn't know he was Roma, because unlike his sister, he could pass as non-Roma, and he was passing as non-Roma. And so this became an important decision for him. Do I express my love of my sister and my pride, or do I continue to pass? And he continued to pass. He didn't say anything. So yes, Bulgarian society has advanced so that Violeta Draganova can be on TV and on the cover of that magazine, but it hasn't progressed nearly enough. I'm not just, of course, looking at questions of racism and intolerance, although that is a major topic that comes up when I talk to people. I'm also looking at economic reform. Who has benefited? Who has not benefited? Democracy. Why do people still say in large numbers that they like democracy, but they don't really like their Democrats, their politicians in the countries they're in? Why do they have so little faith in the institutions, the judicial system, the legislature, the police? And I'm looking at questions of inequality. And of course, I'm looking at people's second thoughts. Second thoughts. As I said, I have people's interviews from 23 years ago. So I have what they said on paper. And very often, people will say to me, I was naive. I was naive. I thought that the market would bring prosperity for everybody. And I realized that that is not true. Not true at all. And just to end, two quick stories from opposite ends. Because sometimes you'll hear from people talking about what's happened in the last 23 years, that there are winners and there are losers in terms of the economic and political transformation. And that determines how people vote. The losers are nostalgic for the old days. The winners like the way things are now because they won. Well, I'm going to give you just very brief descriptions of two people that I've interviewed 23 years later. One is a winner, so to speak, and the other is a loser, but they share the same perspective, even though their economic prospects have been very different. Miroslav Darmov was in the Bulgarian parliament 23 years ago, working for a party called the Movement for Rights and Freedoms, which represented ethnic Turks in Bulgaria. He was at the top of the political pyramid. He was in parliament. He was a spokesperson for the party. When I tried to find him 23 years ago, he disappeared. After 3 years, every mention of him in Bulgaria disappeared. I saw that he left the party. I saw that he created another party in Bulgaria, and then he disappeared. So how did I find him again? Facebook. The only way to find anybody these days. I found a Miroslav Darmov in Kentucky. And I wrote to him and I said, "Dear Miroslav Darmov, you don't know me, I don't know you, but I'm wondering if maybe just by chance you keep in touch with other Miroslav Darmovs around the world, and maybe you know a Miroslav Darmov in Bulgaria." I talked to him 23 years ago. He wrote back, he said, "That's me." I said, "Miroslav, why are you in Kentucky? And what are you doing?" He said, "I'm working in a factory. And I'm really having very difficult time making ends meet." I said, "Miroslav, why are you in a factory in Kentucky?" And Miroslav said, well, because I flew down to Kentucky to interview him, he said to me, "Well, I became completely disillusioned with politics in Bulgaria. I think that nothing changed. It's just controlled by the old guard, by the former Secret Service, and I could not be part of that system. So I left the country. I made a mistake. I went to the United States. He didn't speak English. When I interviewed him in 1990, we did the interview in Russian. He came to the United States at the age of 50 not speaking English. He had a PhD. Didn't matter. They went to New York. Forget about it. New York's way too expensive. Couldn't live there. They heard that Kentucky was cheap, so they went to Kentucky. But there are no jobs in Kentucky for either of them. She's a lawyer. He's got a PhD in psychology. No jobs. His attitude right now is that the system in Bulgaria must be completely transformed. He would like to return to Bulgaria to be part of that, but he doesn't see anything happening right now that shows the prospect of that kind of change. Robert Braun. Some of you may know, Robert Braun is here in Hungary. He's one of the founders of the Raoul Wallenberg Society, which is devoted to human rights issues, Roma, anti-Semitism questions. And so I interviewed him 23 years later. And I said, "Robert, what do you think about what's happened? You supported the changes 23 years ago. You thought that there should be economic change, market change as quickly as possible." And even though Robert Braun has done very, very well economically, he has created several very profitable enterprises and sold them, but he too has the same economic perspective as Miroslav Darmov. He too believes that liberalism has failed. Neoliberalism, market reforms have failed. And so from these opposite ends of the economic spectrum, we see some agreement. Now, unfortunately, I also interviewed Volen Sidorov from Ataka. I interviewed Tamás Hegedűs from Jobbik. I interviewed Daniel Serb from the Party of Rights. These are all far right-wing parties. And when they talk about immigrant rights, when they talk about racism and intolerance, they sound like Nazis. Okay? But when they talk about economic issues, they sound like leftists. They sound like the leftists that don't really exist in large numbers in this part of the world. In other words, the left, which has either been discredited because of its association with communism or because of its association with liberalism, has failed to deliver, and the right has taken its place. And then finally, just because there was someone asked about Islamophobia here in Hungary, generally speaking in this part of the world, we see Islamophobia very similar to anti-Semitism in Poland. Anti-Semitism in Poland is always talked about as anti-Semitism without Jews. I mean, how can you have anti-Semitism without Jews? But you can. You can have very, very few Jews living in Poland, and yet still considerable anti-Semitism. Generally speaking, you see that there are very few Muslims living in this part of the world, except for Bulgaria, except for Albania, except for Bosnia. But the Czech Republic, there are hardly any Muslims living in the Czech Republic. So why is Miloš Zeman, who happens to be now the president of the Czech Republic, why is he talking about his Islamophobia as if this is important to him? Well, Islamophobia here, as in other parts of Europe, serves as a useful way of motivating the base with fear and intolerance. Here, on the other hand, if you talk to Tamás Hegedűs in Jobbik, what does he tell you? He proudly tells you that he is the head of the parliamentary union with Turkey. And he praises Islam, praises the importance of bringing Turkey into the EU. And in fact, Jobbik went head-to-head against every other major populist, right-wing populist party in Europe to support bringing Turkey into the EU. Now, why Jobbik does this is a very long story that some of you know about, having to do with the Turanian Brotherhood, which I won't bore you with, but it makes Hungary slightly different in terms of Islamophobia, the political dynamics, than what you would find in the Czech Republic or in Poland. I'm going to end there. You're right. It's even if you look at the last 10 years, the majority of terrorist acts were committed by non-Muslims in the United States. And you know, it's interesting. It's like when you ask Americans about how much the government spends on foreign aid. Americans think, they'll say like 25%. You know, it's unbelievable the distorted perception Americans have of foreign aid. It's very similar to the question of terrorism. You ask them how many terrorist acts have been committed compared to, say, gun deaths or highway deaths. And they'll say, oh, it's roughly comparable. It's like, what? I mean, if you look at the graphs, I mean, it's terrorist deaths, you know, it's like down here, and highway deaths, gun deaths. I mean, it's the perception of terrorism, because of the media focus on it, and the media focus on primarily the people who are considered to be terrorists by nature, namely Muslims, provides this distorted perception. Joyce Carol Oates, all these kind of people who are held up as liberal models, but they have this one exception they make. And it's almost as if the exception, in some sense, demonstrates in some profound way that they're not naive liberals. Like I'm liberal, but I'm not a naive liberal because I don't like Muslims. This is the Muslim exception in some sense. That it's a lively debate that takes place at different levels. So of course there are movements of women within Islam that kind of are essentially feminist movements. Are they representative of Islam in general? No. I mean, but unfortunately, feminism is often a minority in lots of different traditions. Is there a debate about what women's role should be that takes place at another level in different societies and different cultures? Remember, Islam has 1.4 billion adherents around the world, living in lots of different cultures, lots of different experiences, with lots of different interpretations of the Quran. I mean, it's not just Sunni and Shia. I mean, there are obviously other traditions as well of Islam, and different traditions of interpreting, Muhammad's words. I think generally, I always say, look, there are lots of things that take place under the name of Islam, people claiming the name of Islam, that I don't like. Just as there are lots of things that take place under the name of Christianity that I don't like, or under liberalism, or under whatever. There are plenty of things I don't like. But generally speaking, I make a distinction between groups that are violent and extremist, that claim the mantle of Islam, and then the mainstream of Islam, which encompasses really more than 95% of adherents. For me, the conflict that is taking place around the world, in which most Muslims are being killed, the most violence is being committed, is within Islam, is the debate within Islam between extremist versions, Al-Qaeda, etc., Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in Maghreb, various versions in Asia, and political Islam, which has made some form of accommodation with modernity. In other words, Muslim Brotherhood, or AKP party in Turkey, major party in Indonesia. This is what I believe makes Al-Qaeda the most angry. Not so much the United States, or Western Europe, or Christianity. What Al-Qaeda is interested in is asserting its brand of Islam over other brands of Islam. That's, in some sense, the much more difficult challenge for them than asserting it over rival claims to religious transcendence, from Christians, Jews, Buddhists, Hindus, whatever. I think this is the fundamental mistake that the US government makes, European governments, and not just, but other governments around the world, in putting those two types of political Islam together and asserting that they don't like us, that Islam is against the West. So all the other questions about how Islam addresses women's issue, human rights questions, homosexuality, etc., is inset within this debate inside Islam between an extremist version and a version that is dealing with modernity in its own way, dealing with democracy, dealing with market economics, dealing with a multicultural society. So I would say that broadly speaking. The United States, it's true, if you look at the US government, wages war in predominantly Muslim countries. The victims of drone attacks, etc., are predominantly Muslim. However, we have to point out the United States makes a distinction between what it considers good Muslims and bad Muslims. And sometimes it is not obvious who the good Muslims and who the bad Muslims are. So for instance, the Saudis are good Muslims. Does that have anything to do with their interpretation of Islam? Of course not. Because if we said, well, the United States is only opposed to like the most prehistoric versions of Islam, the Salafist, well, the Saudis have the strictest, most misogynistic versions of Islam. But the United States is perfectly okay with that because Saudi Arabia has traditionally been a US ally in the region for obvious geopolitical and geoenergy reasons. The same has applied across US history. Obviously, we know the United States supplied the Mujahideen during the Afghanistan war, had decided that for whatever reasons, the Mujahideen were our friends against communism, but it wasn't just the Mujahideen. We supported the Muslim Brotherhood. Eisenhower brought the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, Saeed Ramadan's father, to the White House in a secret meeting because the United States saw radical Islam at that time as a useful weapon against Arab nationalism, and Arab nationalism's kind of uniting with communism. When was the only time that you saw Orientalism that kind of romanticized Islam? What was at a time when Islam was on its great decline? So if you look at Edward Said's book, Orientalism, he's describing the period of time, 18th, 19th century, when Islam was on its great, economic slide, which of course culminates with the end of the caliphate in the 1920s. And now we actually see Islam on the rise economically. Turkey, Indonesia. We've seen, of course, the Middle East since the 1960s and 70s with oil and resources. So it's interesting to graph the two things side by side. Islamophobia, Orientalism, one axis, and then the economic fortunes of the Islamic world up and down. And I think you'll see that the two correspond in an interesting way.